June 17th, 1815. The fields outside the village of Waterloo, Belgium. A Belgian farmer named Henri Dubois walked his property at dawn, checking his wheat crops before the summer harvest. What he saw stopped him cold. The sky above his fields had turned black, not with storm clouds, but with birds. 50,000 crows, ravens, and carrion birds circled in a massive spiral formation stretching 3 miles across. They made no sound. They simply circled, descended, and waited. The Battle of Waterloo wouldn't begin for another 24 hours. The birds knew something the armies didn't. They had come early to feed. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Waterloo battlefield crows, 1815 Belgium, where 50,000 carrion birds descended before the first shot was fired, death omens that gathered at history's turning point. Make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers, so drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from and whether you believe animals can sense death before it happens. Let's dive into one of history's most disturbing mysteries. The spring of 1815 had been unnaturally quiet across Europe. After 23 years of nearly continuous warfare, Napoleon Bonaparte had abdicated, been exiled to Elba, and the continent had exhaled. The Congress of Vienna was redrawing the map of Europe. Soldiers had returned to their farms. Mothers had stopped scanning the horizon for messengers bearing death notices. Then, on March 1st, 1815, Napoleon escaped. Within 100 days, he had reclaimed France, raised an army of 280,000 men, and marched north toward Belgium. The Seventh Coalition, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and their allies, scrambled to respond. The Duke of Wellington assembled a multinational force near Brussels. Field Marshal Blücher positioned his Prussian army to the east. Everyone knew a confrontation was inevitable. They just didn't know where or when. The Belgian countryside between Brussels and Charleroi became a chessboard for empires. Small villages like Mont-Saint-Jean, Plancenoit, and Waterloo, previously known only to their few hundred inhabitants, would soon be written in blood across the pages of history. But something else was gathering in Belgium that June, something that moved faster than armies. Local residents began reporting unusual animal behavior starting June 10th. Marie-Claude Beaumont, who operated a tavern in Mont-Saint-Jean, wrote in her diary, "The dogs have ceased barking. They sit and stare toward the south, even through the night. My husband says I am foolish, but I have lived here 40 years and I have never seen them act thus." By June 14th, livestock across the region exhibited signs of extreme distress. Horses refused to graze in certain fields. Cattle broke through fences to avoid particular areas. Pigs, normally vocal animals, fell silent. Hen came the birds. On June 15th, while Napoleon's forces engaged Prussian advance units at Ligny and Quatre Bras, residents of Waterloo and surrounding villages noticed crows gathering in unprecedented numbers. Not flocking for migration, it was the wrong season. Not roosting. They didn't settle in trees. They simply circled, hundreds at first, then thousands, their shadows crossing the fields in hypnotic patterns. Jean-Baptiste Mercier, a local priest, recorded his observations. "I have been pastor of this church for 32 years. Never have I witnessed such an assembly of corvids. They arrive from all directions, north, south, east, west. They converge above the fields between our village and Mont-Saint-Jean. The parishioners are frightened. They ask me if this is a sign from God. I tell them no, it is merely nature, but I confess I do not believe my own words." The Duke of Wellington established his headquarters in Waterloo on the evening of June 17th, seemingly unconcerned with local superstitions. His officers, however, took note. Major Harry Smith of the 95th Rifles wrote, "The men are uneasy. The ravens follow our movements. They perch upon wagons, upon cannons, upon the roofs of every building. They watch us with an intelligence that is most unsettling. Several soldiers have asked permission to shoot them. I have denied these requests as ammunition must be preserved." What Wellington's army didn't know was that the birds weren't following them. The birds had arrived first. The armies had come to where the birds were already waiting. Incident 1, the impossible count. On the morning of June 18th, Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Howe de Lancey, Wellington's chief of staff, ordered a reconnaissance count of the circling birds. 3 separate officers, using telescopes and systematic grid counting methods, arrived at figures between 48,000 and 52,000 individual birds. This was impossible. Ornithologists would later confirm that such a concentration of carrion birds had no precedent in European natural history. The entire crow population of Belgium was estimated at fewer than 30,000 birds. Local species, carrion crows, hooded crows, ravens, rooks, were joined by species that had no business being in Belgium: Spanish imperial crows, Nordic ravens, even several specimens identified as Eastern European species not seen west of Poland. They had traveled hundreds of miles. Some had flown perhaps 1,000 miles or more, all to converge on 30 square kilometers of Belgian farmland. Captain Cavalier Mercer of the Royal Horse Artillery recorded, "One of my men, a country fellow from Yorkshire, approached me before dawn. He was pale as death. He said the birds only gather in such numbers in one circumstance, before a massacre of such scale that the land itself calls to them. I asked him how he knew this. He said his grandfather, who lived through the plague, told him. I dismissed him, but his words lodged in my mind like a splinter." Incident 2. The feeding frenzy that came too soon at 11:30 a.m. on June 18th. Approximately 30 minutes before the first French artillery barrage, something inexplicable occurred. The circling birds suddenly descended. They landed in the fields between the two armies, in areas where no fighting had yet occurred, where no blood had been spilled. They began feeding, not pecking at the ground searching for food, but feeding with the frenzied intensity of carrion birds at a fresh kill. Ensign Rees Howell Grano of the 1st Foot Guards documented what he witnessed. The ravens descended upon a section of field near the Hougoumont farm. We could see them clearly through our glasses. They tore at the earth as though rending flesh. They fought amongst themselves. They gorged themselves on nothing, for there was nothing there. The ground was bare, yet they fed and fed and fed. Several soldiers broke ranks to investigate. What they found disturbed them so profoundly that 2 refused to return to formation and were placed under guard for suspected cowardice. Private Thomas Jeremiah of the 51st Regiment gave this testimony later. "The birds were eating the future. I know how mad that sounds, sir, but I saw it. The ground was empty, but they were tearing at something, and when I looked closely, very closely, I swear I could see impressions in the earth, body-shaped impressions, dozens of them, hundreds, like the ground was showing us what would be there in a few hours' time." His account was officially dismissed as pre-battle hysteria. Incident 3. The birds that landed on living men at approximately 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes before Napoleon's artillery opened fire. Individual birds began landing on soldiers, not on shoulders or helmets, as opportunistic birds might do. On chests, directly over the heart. Lieutenant William Leake of the 52nd Regiment recorded, "A raven, larger than any I had seen, landed upon the chest of Private Henderson. The man was standing in formation. The bird landed and would not be dislodged. Henderson struck at it with his hand. It pecked him viciously but would not fly away. Sergeant Major Gann pulled the bird off by its neck and wrung it. The bird's talons had penetrated Henderson's uniform coat. They had drawn blood in the exact pattern of a musket ball wound. Over the next 12 minutes, soldiers across Wellington's line reported similar incidents. Always a single bird, always landing on the chest, always requiring force to remove. Staff officers began keeping a list of affected soldiers, intending to investigate this bizarre phenomenon after the battle. That list contained 47 names. By sunset, 43 of those 47 men would be dead, most from chest wounds. Incident 4. The sound at 11:55 a.m., 5 minutes before the French barrage commenced. The birds still on the ground suddenly ceased all activity. 50,000 birds fell absolutely silent. Then, in perfect unison, they began to make a sound that no bird species was known to produce. Multiple witnesses described it identically. A low, sustained note, almost musical, that seemed to resonate from the earth itself rather than from the birds. It lasted for exactly 90 seconds. Sergeant William Lawrence of the 40th Regiment. It was not a bird sound. It was the sound the world makes when it is preparing to break. The sound of a door opening between this life and whatever comes after. Every man in my company heard it. Some fell to their knees, some wept. I stood rigid because I did not know what else to do. At precisely 12:00 noon, the sound stopped. 5 minutes later, French artillery fired the first shots of the Battle of Waterloo. The birds ascended into the air and resumed their silent circling. They would not land again until the killing began in earnest. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries, and let's discover what happens next. The Battle of Waterloo raged from noon until approximately 9:00 p.m. on June 18, 1815. 25,000 men died. 25,000 more were wounded. As the sun set and the guns fell silent, as Napoleon's Imperial Guard broke and the French army retreated in chaos, as Wellington's exhausted soldiers held their positions, the birds descended. This is when multiple witnesses realized something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The birds had known exactly where to wait. The densest concentrations of carrion birds landed in precise locations: the Hougoumont farm complex, the La Haye Sainte farmhouse, the sunken lane of Ohain, the slopes where the French cavalry made their desperate charges. These were the areas of highest casualties. But these were also the exact areas where the birds had been circling most intensely before the battle began. Captain Mercer wrote in his journal, "They descended with such numbers and such veracity that we had to drive them off with musket butts to recover our wounded. I saw a raven land upon a dying French cuirassier who yet breathed. The bird positioned itself upon the man's chest and waited, not feeding, just waiting, watching the man's eyes. When the light left those eyes, I swear this on my soul, the bird cocked its head as though it had witnessed something we could not see. Only then did it begin to feed." But the true horror emerged over the following 3 days as military authorities, medical personnel, and civilian volunteers attempted to clear the battlefield. The birds had attracted others, professional corpse scavengers. Within 48 hours of the battle's conclusion, an army of a different kind descended upon Waterloo: tooth pullers, bone collectors, hair merchants, professional scavengers who followed European battlefields like pilot fish following sharks. They came from London, Paris, Amsterdam, Brussels, and cities as far away as Geneva and Hamburg. Some traveled in organized crews, others worked independently, all the same purpose: to harvest the dead for profit. Human teeth, particularly the teeth of young soldiers, were in tremendous demand for dentures. A complete set of battlefield teeth could sell for 3 guineas in London, equivalent to several months' wages for a laborer. Extracted teeth from Waterloo became known as Waterloo teeth, and were advertised as such by London dentists for decades. Hair was collected and sold to wig makers. Brass buttons and metal insignia were stripped and melted down. Clothing was removed, cleaned, and resold. But the most profitable commodity was bones. British investigators arriving on June 22 to document French casualties for official records made a discovery that would trigger a diplomatic incident and an investigation that continued for 6 years. Major Frederick Phillips Robinson documented, "We found systematic excavation operations in progress. Large sections of the battlefield had been stripped not just of bodies, but of the earth itself. Trenches 6 feet deep ran for dozens of yards. French, British, Dutch, and Prussian dead were being processed without distinction. Bodies were laid in rows, teeth extracted first, hair shorn, clothing removed and sorted. Then the systematic dismemberment, arms and legs separated at joints, skulls detached, ribs separated, all bones stripped of flesh and sorted by size and type. The bones were being loaded into wagons by the ton. The destination, England. British bone merchants had contracts with sugar refineries and ceramic manufacturers. Bones were processed into bone char, a filtering agent used to refine sugar into its pure white form. Bone ash was a critical component in fine china production. The china dishes and sugar cubes gracing tables across England were being manufactured from the bodies of men who had died at Waterloo. The investigation revealed an organized industrial operation. Contracts had been negotiated weeks before the battle. Ships had been chartered and were waiting at Ostend. Crushing facilities in Sheffield and Stoke-on-Trent had expanded operations in anticipation of the supply. The bone merchants had known, just like the birds they had known. The central question, a British parliamentary inquiry in 1816, focused on a disturbing question: how had the bone merchants known to position themselves for such a massive operation? Testimony revealed that the London bone-crushing facilities had been stockpiling coal and expanding furnace capacity since early May 1815, weeks before Napoleon even left Paris to begin his campaign. When questioned, bone merchant Samuel Morrison stated, "It was not speculation, sir. We had assurances from our suppliers in Belgium that a major event was forthcoming. They had begun preliminary positioning based on bird movements, sir." The inquiry pressed, "You made commercial decisions based on the behavior of birds?" Morrison replied, "Not just birds, sir. Other signs. The way livestock behaved. The way dogs acted. The are those on the continent who have studied these things for generations. Those who know how to read what nature tells us about where death will occur." The inquiry uncovered a network of what could only be described as death predictors. Individuals, primarily in rural Belgium and northern France, who claimed ability to forecast large-scale casualties based on animal behavior patterns. These individuals had been employed, sometimes for years, by bone merchants, tooth pullers, and other battlefield scavengers. They were paid to watch for the signs. And in June 1815, all the signs had pointed to Waterloo. The cover-up attempts the British government faced a public relations catastrophe. British soldiers' remains had been commercially processed and sold. The public was consuming products manufactured from their sons' and husbands' bones. The official response was swift and devastating. All involved bone merchants were prosecuted under existing laws regarding the desecration of British military dead. 12 men received prison sentences. 3 were transported to Australia. The remainder were bankrupted through fines. The Belgian death predictors were investigated by local authorities. Most disappeared. Whether they fled or were disappeared remains unclear. All official records of the parliamentary inquiry were sealed for 50 years. When finally released in 1866, crucial testimony pages were missing. Modern historians believe approximately 30% of the inquiry's documentation was permanently destroyed. The remaining bone merchants pivoted to a new narrative. They claimed they had arrived after the battle, that they had not predicted anything, that bird behavior was mere coincidence mentioned in testimony only due to the stress of questioning. But private letters and diaries tell a different story. The Waterloo bone harvesting scandal had consequences that rippled through Victorian society and changed how Europe approached battlefield dead. Legal reforms. The British Parliament passed the Battlefield Dead Protection Act of 1817, making it illegal to commercially process remains of British military personnel. This was Britain's first legislation specifically protecting the dignity of war dead. France passed similar legislation in 1818. Prussia in 1819. The Congress of Vienna was retroactively amended to include protocols for battlefield dead. Modern international laws regarding war dead trace their lineage directly to Waterloo. Scientific investigation. The bird phenomenon at Waterloo became subject to serious scientific inquiry in the 1820s and 1830s. Ornithologists, naturalists, and early behavioral scientists attempted to explain how so many birds could have gathered before casualties occurred. Theories proposed included extreme atmospheric sensitivity, allowing birds to detect pheromones released by humans under extreme stress, electromagnetic field disruptions caused by the massing of metal weapons, and ammunition infrasound detection. RDS sensing vibrations from troop movements dozens of miles away, pure coincidence, with post-battle confirmation bias making the timing seem more precise than it was. None of these theories adequately explained how birds from hundreds of miles away converged on such a specific location. The phenomenon remained unexplained. Similar cases emerged once researchers began looking. They found patterns throughout military history. At Gettysburg in July 1863, Union soldiers reported massive turkey vulture concentrations before the battle. A regimental chaplain documented, "The birds numbered in thousands. They arrived July 1st in the morning. The first shots were not fired until afternoon." Before the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, British and French soldiers reported crow populations increasing dramatically in the week preceding the offensive. Over 20,000 casualties occurred on the first day. At Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers reported that ravens had already occupied the destroyed city before German forces entered. The battle would last 5 months and kill nearly 2 million people. Modern military historians have documented at least 43 large-scale battles where unusual bird concentrations preceded major casualties. The pattern holds across continents, time periods, and bird species. The community impact. The village of Waterloo itself became a place of pilgrimage and horror. Victor Hugo visited in 1861 and incorporated the battlefield into Les Miserables. He wrote of the birds that knew and the earth that remembered. Local Belgian families who had lived through the battle passed down stories. Many involved the same detail: the birds had watched them, not pecked at corpses mindlessly, watched, as though bearing witness. Marie-Claude Beaumont, the tavern owner who had documented early animal behavior, lived until 1848. Her final diary entry, written days before her death at age 73, stated, "They are circling again, not in such numbers as before, but they are here. Something is coming. I am old and I am dying, so perhaps they circle for me, or perhaps the earth has more breaking to do." There was no major battle near Waterloo in 1848, but that year, revolutions swept through Europe. Tens of thousands died in the springtime of the peoples. Perhaps the birds knew. What this reveals about human nature. The Waterloo bone scandal exposes a truth that society prefers to ignore. Death is profitable, and humans will always find ways to commodify mortality. But the bird phenomenon reveals something deeper and more disturbing. Despite centuries of scientific advancement, despite our technology and our certainty about how the world works, nature retains knowledge we cannot access. Animals perceive realities we cannot measure. The bone merchants understood this. That's why they hired death predictors. That's why they watched the birds. Modern militaries still track animal behavior. Search and rescue teams use it to locate disaster victims. SCI. Scientists study it to predict earthquakes and tsunamis. We've given it sophisticated names: biopremonition, environmental sensitivity, collective behavioral patterns. But we still don't understand it. The birds at Waterloo knew 50,000 men would die in those fields before the armies even arrived. They gathered to bear witness to history's breaking point. And when it was over, when the bodies had been harvested and processed and sold, when the battlefield had been cleared and the fields returned to farmers, the birds finally dispersed. They flew south, north, east, west, back to wherever they had come from, returning to wait for the next time the earth would call them. The next time humans would gather in their thousands to kill each other. The next time death would need witnesses. What do you think allowed the birds to sense death before it occurred? Was it natural biological sensitivity we don't yet understand, or something more supernatural? Could the bone merchants have truly predicted the battle's location based solely on animal behavior? Or was there a more sinister network at work? Leave your theories in the comments below. If you found this story as disturbing as we did, subscribe to Fear's Sermon for more lost chapters of history where the truth proved more terrifying than any fiction. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another dark mystery that history tried to bury. Tell us where you're watching from and whether you believe animals can sense death before humans can. We love hearing from our community of truth seekers. Until next time, remember, nature sees what we refuse to believe. See you in the next video.